The O.J. Simpson Trial. In 1994, former football star O.J. Simpson was accused of murdering his ex-wife and her friend. His highly publicized trial was filled with twists and turns that kept the world captivated. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of fascinating topics like this one. Chapter 1: The Discovery. Detective Mark Jensen couldn't believe his eyes when he arrived at the scene. The bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman lay in a pool of blood, their lifeless forms stark against the immaculate lawn of Nicole's Brentwood estate. Jensen's gut told him this was going to be a high-profile case, but he couldn't have anticipated the media frenzy that was about to unfold. As he surveyed the scene, Jensen noticed that there were signs of a struggle. The gate leading to the back alley was open, and there were signs of forced entry on the front door. Jensen took note of everything, knowing that these details could be crucial in the investigation. As the crime scene investigators arrived, Jensen's mind was racing with questions. Who would do this? Why? And most importantly, where was O.J. Simpson? Nicole's ex-husband had a history of domestic violence, and Jensen knew that he was the prime suspect. The whole world is going to be watching this, Jensen muttered to himself as he walked around the perimeter of the crime scene. He knew that this case was going to be one for the history books. Chapter 2: The Arrest. The news of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman's murder quickly spread, and it wasn't long before O.J. Simpson became the prime suspect. Detective Jensen and his team were able to track down Simpson's whereabouts, and they found him hiding out at a friend's house in the San Fernando Valley. As soon as Simpson was taken into custody, the media circus began. Reporters from all over the world descended upon Los Angeles, hungry for any scraps of information about the case. Simpson's arrest was caught on camera, and the footage was broadcasted around the clock on every major news network. Simpson vehemently denied any involvement in the murders. "I love Nicole. She was my life," he told reporters as he was being escorted out of the police station. "I would never do anything to hurt her." Despite Simpson's protests of innocence, the evidence against him continued to mount. Blood samples found at the crime scene matched Simpson's DNA, and a pair of gloves found near the scene had his blood and the victim's blood on them. Simpson's defense team, led by Robert Shapiro and including famous lawyer Johnny Cochran, quickly went to work. They argued that the evidence against Simpson was circumstantial at best, and that there was no direct proof that he committed the murders. The media continued to scrutinize every move Simpson made, and the public was divided. Some believed that Simpson was guilty, while others thought he was being unfairly targeted because of his race. The stage was set for one of the most high-profile trials in American history. Chapter 3: The Defense. The team of lawyers representing O.J. Simpson was a formidable one. In addition to Robert Shapiro and Johnny Cochran, the team included F. Lee Bailey, Alan Dershowitz, and Robert Kardashian. The defense team immediately went to work, attempting to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They argued that the LAPD had mishandled the investigation and had tunnel vision, focusing solely on Simpson as the culprit. They also brought up the possibility that evidence may have been planted or mishandled, leading to a tainted crime scene. The defense team was able to successfully argue that the gloves found near the scene did not fit Simpson, despite the infamous moment during the trial when Simpson tried them on in front of the jury. They also attempted to undermine the credibility of the prosecution's expert witnesses, arguing that their analysis was flawed and biased. Throughout the trial, the defense team presented an image of Simpson as a loving father and a beloved figure in the community. They argued that he had no motive to kill his ex-wife and her friend, and that the prosecution had failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense team also attempted to raise doubts about the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, including the police officers who were involved in the investigation. They suggested that the officers may have been motivated by racism or a desire for fame and fortune. As the trial continued, tensions grew higher and higher. The defense team's tactics were working, and it seemed that Simpson may have a chance at acquittal. But the prosecution still had a few tricks up their sleeves. Chapter 4: The Prosecution. The prosecution team was led by Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden. They faced an uphill battle in the trial, as they had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that O.J. Simpson was guilty of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Throughout the trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case against Simpson. They argued that the evidence pointed to his guilt, and that his behavior before and after the murders was suspicious. They also presented witnesses who testified to seeing Simpson in the vicinity of the crime scene around the time of the murders. However, the prosecution team faced challenges in their efforts to secure a conviction. The defense team was able to undermine the credibility of some of their witnesses, and the trial was also marked by racial tensions, with the defense team suggesting that the LAPD was motivated by racism and that the case against Simpson was part of a broader pattern of institutional racism. Despite these challenges, the prosecution team remained focused on their mission to secure a conviction. They presented forensic evidence, including DNA evidence, that they believed conclusively linked Simpson to the murders. They also attempted to counter the defense team's narrative that the LAPD had mishandled the investigation, arguing that the defense team had not presented any concrete evidence to support these claims. As the trial drew to a close, the prosecution team delivered their closing arguments, making an emotional plea for justice for the victims and their families. They argued that the evidence pointed to Simpson's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and that he should be found guilty of the murders. Chapter 5: The Trial Begins. The O.J. Simpson trial began on January 24, 1995. The trial was held at the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, and it was presided over by Judge Lysander. The first order of business was jury selection, which was a highly contentious process. Both the prosecution and the defense teams sought to select jurors who they believed would be sympathetic to their case. The defense team in particular sought to select jurors who were African American, as they believed that this demographic would be more likely to be skeptical of the LAPD's motives and to view Simpson favorably. Once the jury was selected, the trial officially began. The prosecution team presented their opening statements, in which they laid out their case against Simpson. They argued that the evidence pointed to Simpson's guilt and that he had a clear motive for the murders, as he had a history of domestic violence and was jealous of Nicole's relationships with other men. The defense team then presented their opening statements. They argued that Simpson was innocent and that the LAPD had mishandled the investigation. They also suggested that the murders may have been committed by someone else, and that the evidence against Simpson was circumstantial. Over the course of the trial, both sides presented witnesses and evidence to support their arguments. The prosecution team presented a wide range of forensic evidence, including DNA evidence that they claimed conclusively linked Simpson to the murders. They also presented testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen Simpson near the crime scene around the time of the murders. The defense team, on the other hand, sought to undermine the prosecution's case by attacking the credibility of the witnesses and by raising questions about the validity of the forensic evidence. They also presented their own witnesses, including experts who testified that the evidence against Simpson was weak and unreliable. As the trial progressed, tensions between the two sides began to mount. The trial was widely covered by the media, and both the prosecution and defense teams were acutely aware of the public scrutiny of their performance. Despite the challenges they faced, both the prosecution and defense teams remained committed to their mission. For the prosecution, this meant securing a conviction and delivering justice for the victims and their families. For the defense, this meant securing an acquittal for their client and proving his innocence. Chapter 6: The Bronco Chase.
On June 17, 1994, millions of Americans were glued to their TV screens as they watched O.J. Simpson lead police on a high-speed car chase through the streets of Los Angeles.
The chase began when Simpson failed to surrender to police, as he had been ordered to do in connection with the murders of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman. Instead, he fled in his friend Al Cowling's white Ford Bronco, with Cowlings at the wheel. As the chase progressed, dozens of police cars followed the Bronco, with news helicopters capturing the entire event from above. The chase lasted for over an hour, with Simpson and Cowlings driving through the streets of LA at speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. At one point, Simpson could be seen holding a gun to his own head, leading to fears that he might take his own life. Eventually, the chase came to an end when Simpson and Cowlings arrived at Simpson's home in Brentwood. The events of the Bronco chase captivated the nation and sparked intense speculation about what Simpson's motives might be. Some believed that he was trying to make a statement, while others thought that he might be planning to flee the country. As it turned out, Simpson was ultimately taken into custody without incident. He was charged with 2 counts of murder and taken to trial, where the events of the Bronco chase would become a key part of the prosecution's case against him. Despite the fact that the chase did not result in any injuries or damage to property, it has become an enduring symbol of the O.J. Simpson case. For many, the sight of Simpson in the back of the Bronco, with dozens of police cars in pursuit, remains one of the most iconic images of the 1990s. Chapter 7: The Evidence. With Simpson in custody, the prosecution began to build their case against him. Key pieces of evidence were presented in court, including the infamous glove found at the crime scene, as well as blood samples taken from both Simpson and the victims. The prosecution argued that the blood evidence proved that Simpson was the killer, while the defense team argued that the evidence was unreliable and that Simpson had been framed by the LAPD. The trial also featured testimony from expert witnesses, including forensic scientists and DNA analysts, who offered conflicting opinions on the significance of the blood evidence. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when prosecutor Christopher Darden asked Simpson to try on the glove found at the crime scene. The glove appeared to be too small for Simpson's hand, leading him to famously declare, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." However, many legal experts believe that the prosecution's case was undermined by mistakes and missteps, including the mishandling of evidence and allegations of police misconduct. Despite these challenges, the prosecution was able to present a compelling case, and the trial quickly became a media sensation. Millions of Americans tuned in to watch the daily proceedings, and the trial was covered extensively by the news media. As the trial progressed, tensions between the defense and prosecution continued to escalate. Both sides employed aggressive tactics, with the defense team accusing the prosecution of misconduct and the prosecution accusing the defense of playing to the jury's emotions. Ultimately, the jury was left to decide whether or not O.J. Simpson was guilty of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. The verdict would be the most closely watched in American history. Chapter 8: The Furman Tapes. As the trial continued, the prosecution's case against Simpson began to unravel due to the discovery of a series of tapes featuring LAPD detective Mark Furman. In the tapes, Furman could be heard using racial slurs and making other incriminating statements. The tapes were first discovered by the defense team, who argued that they showed a pattern of police misconduct and racism that could have been used to frame Simpson. The tapes were eventually played in court, and the impact on the trial was profound. The defense team argued that Furman's involvement in the case was evidence of a larger conspiracy against Simpson, while the prosecution argued that the tapes were irrelevant to the case at hand. The tapes proved to be a turning point in the trial, with many observers believing that they damaged the credibility of the prosecution's case. The defense team was able to use the tapes to undermine the prosecution's witnesses, including Furman himself, and to suggest that the LAPD was willing to go to great lengths to frame Simpson. The tapes also brought issues of race to the forefront of the trial, with many commentators arguing that the case was being tried in the context of larger issues of police brutality and racial injustice. Despite the impact of the tapes, the trial continued, and both the defense and prosecution continued to present their cases. As the trial entered its final stages, tensions between the two sides continued to rise, and the jury was left to decide whether or not Simpson was guilty of the murders. Chapter 9: The Defense Rests. With the presentation of the Furman tapes, the defense rested their case, choosing not to call O.J. Simpson to the stand. Many legal analysts were surprised by this decision, as Simpson's testimony could have potentially swayed the jury one way or another. The defense team argued that the prosecution had not presented enough evidence to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt and that Simpson's testimony was unnecessary. In the following days, the prosecution and defense gave their closing arguments, with both sides making their final push for guilty or not guilty verdict. The prosecution emphasized the physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, while the defense argued that the prosecution had failed to prove Simpson's guilt and that there was reasonable doubt in the case. As the jury deliberated, tensions in Los Angeles continued to rise, with many fearing the potential for riots or violence depending on the outcome of the trial.
Finally, on October 3, 1995, the verdict was announced.
The jury found O.J. Simpson not guilty of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. The reaction to the verdict was immediate and intense, with celebrations in the streets among Simpson's supporters and outrage among those who believed he was guilty. The trial had captured the attention of the nation and had become a lightning rod for issues of race and justice. In the aftermath of the verdict, many questions remained unanswered. Was O.J. Simpson truly innocent, or had he gotten away with murder? Had the prosecution bungled the case, or had the LAPD engaged in a conspiracy to frame Simpson? Chapter 10: The Prosecution's Closing Arguments. The prosecution's closing arguments began with prosecutor Marcia Clark delivering an impassioned speech, calling O.J. Simpson a murderer who had brutally killed two innocent people. Clark emphasized the physical evidence presented during the trial, including the bloody glove found at the crime scene and the blood trail leading from the scene to Simpson's home. Clark also addressed the defense's claims of police misconduct, arguing that the evidence was overwhelming and that any alleged misconduct had no bearing on the case. She urged the jury to hold Simpson accountable for his crimes and deliver a guilty verdict. Next, prosecutor Christopher Darden took the stand and delivered his closing argument. Darden's argument focused on the timeline of events on the night of the murders and highlighted the testimony of witnesses who saw Simpson near the crime scene around the time of the murders. Darden also addressed the issue of race, acknowledging that it was a factor in the trial but arguing that the evidence against Simpson was too strong to ignore. He implored the jury to look past Simpson's celebrity status and deliver justice for the victims. Finally, lead prosecutor Gil Garcetti delivered the prosecution's final argument. Garcetti focused on the physical evidence and DNA analysis, arguing that the odds of the blood evidence not belonging to Simpson were 1 in 9.7 billion. He also addressed the defense's claims of police misconduct, arguing that the evidence had been properly collected and analyzed. Garcetti ended his argument with an emotional plea to the jury, asking them to deliver justice for the victims and their families. As the prosecution's closing arguments came to a close, tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury was now tasked with weighing the evidence presented by both sides and reaching a verdict. Chapter 11: The Defense's Closing Arguments. The defense's closing arguments began with Robert Shapiro taking the stand. Shapiro argued that the prosecution had failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt and urged the jury to consider the possibility that someone else had committed the murders. Shapiro emphasized the lack of physical evidence connecting Simpson to the crime scene and highlighted the inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline of events. He also addressed the issue of police misconduct, arguing that the LAPD had a history of racism and corruption and that the evidence had been mishandled. Next, defense attorney Johnny Cochran delivered his closing argument. Cochran focused on the glove found at the crime scene and famously stated, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." Cochran argued that the glove did not fit Simpson's hand and that the prosecution's theory of how the glove ended up at the scene was flawed. Cochran also addressed the issue of race, arguing that the LAPD had a history of targeting and mistreating African Americans. He urged the jury to consider the possibility that the police had framed Simpson in an effort to convict a high-profile African American defendant. Finally, lead defense attorney Robert Kardashian delivered the defense's final argument. Kardashian, emotional, pleaded with the jury to consider the impact a guilty verdict would have on Simpson and his family. He also emphasized Simpson's status as a beloved celebrity and argued that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence. As the defense's closing arguments came to a close, the tension in the courtroom remained high. The jury was now tasked with deciding the fate of O.J. Simpson, and the outcome of the trial hung in the balance. Chapter 12: The Verdict. The day of the verdict arrived, and the courtroom was packed with spectators and media personnel. As the judge read the verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. Simpson sat stoically, his eyes fixed on the judge. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours, and as the judge announced their decision, a hush fell over the room. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Renthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder, the judge read aloud. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Simpson's family and friends cheered and hugged each other. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some celebrating the verdict and others expressing their outrage and disbelief. The aftermath of the trial was both immediate and long-lasting. Simpson's acquittal was met with mixed reactions from the public, with some hailing it as a triumph of the justice system and others decrying it as an example of the wealthy and famous receiving preferential treatment. For Simpson, life after the trial was never the same. Despite his acquittal, many viewed him as a pariah, and he faced intense scrutiny and criticism in the years following the trial. He also faced legal challenges, including a wrongful death civil suit brought by the families of the victims, which he was found liable for. As the dust settled on the trial, many questions remained unanswered. The case had exposed deep-seated issues within the criminal justice system, including issues of race, police misconduct, and the influence of celebrity. Chapter 13: The Civil Trial. Following his criminal acquittal, Simpson found himself facing another legal battle, a wrongful death civil suit brought by the families of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman. The civil trial began in 1996, and this time, Simpson would not be granted immunity from testifying. The evidence presented at the civil trial was similar to that of the criminal trial, but this time, Simpson was forced to take the stand and answer questions under oath. His testimony was often evasive and contradictory, and the plaintiff's attorneys used it to paint him as a liar and a killer. The trial lasted several months, and in the end, the jury found Simpson liable for the deaths of Simpson and Goldman. The families were awarded $33.5 million in damages, a sum that Simpson would struggle to pay for years to come. The civil trial had a profound impact on Simpson's life, both financially and emotionally. He was forced to sell off many of his assets to pay the damages, and he struggled to maintain his public image in the wake of the verdict. For the families of the victims, the civil trial provided some measure of closure, though it could never bring their loved ones back. The trial also further exposed the flaws and biases of the criminal justice system, particularly in cases involving high-profile defendants. Chapter 14: Simpson's life after the trial. After the trial, Simpson's life was never the same. He had lost many of his friends and supporters, and his reputation was tarnished by the accusations against him. He continued to live in Los Angeles, but he mostly kept to himself, avoiding the media and the public eye as much as possible. Despite his financial struggles, Simpson continued to live a comfortable lifestyle, largely thanks to the support of his children and a few remaining friends. He even attempted to revive his career in entertainment, hosting a short-lived reality show called Juiced and making several cameo appearances in movies and television shows. However, Simpson's attempts at a comeback were met with widespread criticism and backlash. Many people still believed he was guilty of the murders, and his continued presence in the public eye was seen as a painful reminder of the tragedy. In 2007, Simpson made headlines once again when he was arrested for armed robbery in Las Vegas. He and several accomplices had broken into a hotel room to steal sports memorabilia that Simpson claimed belonged to him. He was eventually convicted of armed robbery and kidnapping and sentenced to 33 years in prison. Simpson's time in prison was marked by controversy and drama. He was granted parole in 2017 after serving 9 years, and he was released from prison later that year. Since his release, Simpson has largely stayed out of the public eye, although he occasionally posts videos and updates on social media. Despite his legal troubles and the lingering suspicion surrounding him, Simpson remains a polarizing figure in American culture. For many, he is a symbol of injustice and a reminder of the flaws of the criminal justice system. For others, he is simply a former football star and entertainer whose legacy has been forever overshadowed by the tragedy of the O.J. Simpson case. Chapter 15: The Legacy of the Trial. The O.J. Simpson trial was one of the most significant events in American legal history, and its impact can still be felt today. The trial raised important questions about race, class, and the criminal justice system, and it sparked intense debate and discussion across the country. One of the most enduring legacies of the trial is its impact on the media. The case was one of the first to be covered extensively by cable news networks, and it ushered in a new era of sensationalistic and 24-hour news coverage. The trial also showed the power of the media to shape public opinion and influence the course of a legal case. The trial also had a significant impact on the criminal justice system. Many legal experts and scholars have pointed to the Simpson case as an example of the flaws and biases in the system, particularly in how it handles cases involving race and celebrity. The trial highlighted the importance of jury selection, the use of expert witnesses, and the need for transparency and accountability in the legal process. In addition to its legal and cultural impact, the trial also had a profound effect on the families of the victims. For many of them, the trial was a painful and traumatic experience, and it reopened old wounds and unresolved questions about the deaths of their loved ones. Some of them continued to fight for justice long after the trial was over, seeking to hold Simpson accountable in civil court and to find closure for their loss. Today, more than 2 decades after the trial, the legacy of the O.J. Simpson case continues to resonate with the public. The trial remains one of the most iconic and controversial legal dramas in American history, and it continues to inspire debates and discussions about justice, race, and the media. As for O.J. Simpson himself, his legacy will always be tied to the trial and the events surrounding it. Whether he's remembered as a fallen hero, a villain, or something in between, his story will continue to fascinate and intrigue future generations, serving as a reminder of the complexities and contradictions of American life.